working. Now it's working.
Okay, yeah.
What if we start with some general questions about the course, first half roughly, and then depending on how much you want to discuss this, we can then discuss the readings for today on Lipset and Rokkanl. And what Lipset and Rokkanl do, as well as the big theme of the whole course, is, and is very explicit here, Lipset Rokkanl, is how much these models have changed over the 19th and 20th and into the 21st century political systems. And that is, it's the political, the actors, the participants, the countries, national and local politics, all of these have been deeply changing. And the most visible way to see this is in the writings of Seymour Martin Lipset. And he was the leading theorist, the leading writer, the leading synthesizer. And this book with Lipset and Rokkanl is really empirical, with lots of material explicitly addressing with the changes from the 19th century and the rise of class politics. That looks okay?
No, I think that's
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me raise it a bit. Thank you. From the 19th to the 20th century onward, the decline, especially of agriculture, which was 50% in many of the European countries, higher in the U.S., much higher in China, or for instance, through much of the 20th century. But then the rise of the working class, blue collar voters, labor parties representing them. This is really with industry, the rise of industry. And Lipset himself in the 1930s was a Marxist Trotskyite, and he then saw this happening, and the frame, by the time he was doing the book, really the first major book here, is Political Man, which he still called a secular Marxist book, focusing on conflict, and in this era, this is really the capitalists versus the workers. But he then adds, including in this book, he has a chapter, for instance, on working class authoritarianism. And the authoritarianism came from Adorno and Horkheimer, the Frankfurt School. They had a book on the rise of Hitler and how the authoritarian personality style of the Germans resonated with, and they liked that kind of tough leadership, the parades, the SS, the SA, but they had been fighting. They were almost fighting with the Communist Party. They had their militias in the streets in the late 20s, 1930s. Hitler himself spent a year in jail. He wrote his book Mein Kampf, My Battle, and then basically implemented this with many of it. But he never had a majority. He was never democratically elected. So they did things illegally, but they pressured people, and so the president appointed him even though he didn't have the votes because of stuff in the streets. So the battles in the streets were beginning to be visible there, clearly were, and as well as with Mussolini, as well as with Franco in Spain. So the fascists emerged when big battles with the communist parties in these three countries, most visibly. Then obviously World War II with Japan as well. So Japan had occupied most of Korea, that is all of Korea, for most of the 20th century. Japan really, the Japanese with the emperor in the late 30s invaded. I think it was Shanghai. It was a huge battle within China, and the Japanese were very victorious. And so the Japanese, reinforced by that, had enough sense and then Hitler having dramatic success with their tanks rolling across most of Western Europe, France, Belgium, Northern Europe, etc. So it looked as if the future was strength, force, military tactics, etc. And so the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and only then in 1941 did the Americans start. I mean, until in 1941, the Chicago Tribune had a priest, Roman Catholic priest, flying around with this plane, hired by the Chicago Tribune, and the editorials by McCormick Place here, owner of McCormick Place, of McCormick newspaper, basically said, leave Europe to the Europeans, stay out. This is just we want to be, and the priest who went around basically said the same thing. The Irish political leaders, the Irish Catholics in Chicago and in many other cities, said it most explicitly: let the English go. We hate the English anyway. And so, and that only changed with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So it was, at that point, Europe and Asia were already well into the war, and the Americans were starting late. Okay, but then they began actively. But then, after the war, then there were drastic changes around the entire world. Those were there, and in a sense, the post-World War II changes gradually built a new sort of political system until 1968. And the readings we have for today, I'm sort of framing the whole course here. The big thing to point out was, in the Lipset Rokkanl synthesis of what had happened in the 19th, 20th century up to 1968 was, there were no social movements, no women, no environmentalists, no human rights advocates, no gays in politics visibly and separately as an organized group, no feminists. This was basically still blue collar stuff, blue collar, white collar, and in Norway, the Rokkanl is adding the distinctiveness, the battles within. What was the big battle in those years in the 1920s and 30s? Or one of them was
Peasants. The Norwegian peasants against the city people.
Yes, peasants, but some of those folks said, we will. It's not just in America. Abolish alcohol, showing how far that is from. Okay, so this is Woodrow Wilson. The League of Nations had been created after World War I to try to make peace. It was, and then he embraced prohibition, but prohibition in the U.S. was Al Capone. It was a political disaster. Okay, it gave Chicago quite a name, which still is around the world. Okay, so if that's my overview, ending with 68 in a sense. The other big book. Sorry, go ahead.
No question. When I was reading this, I thought about what you just said about the social movement starting in 1968, but it was also the same year as the Prague. You think?
What's Prague?
Prague in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, explain to the
others.
Well,
you had Hungary in 1956 in Budapest, was the first hit against the communism, and then in 1968 you had the revolution in Prague against the communism.
Okay.
And I thought at the beginning they referred to that, but then as I kept reading, it was more to do with the social movement as such. So I just want to ask.
I don't know what PRAC refers to there. So there's so many acronyms that. Maybe I knew it at some point, but it's history for now, or distant enough history, I would say. it's not going to be in the exam. Okay. Look it up. It's probably in Wikipedia. If you take a look. Other questions, big and small? That is, we can discuss on these wherever you want to focus. Go ahead.
I mean, I guess it seems to be the case at this point, but are we going to continue on with, I guess, macro level analysis versus like anything on
Anything like?
on the ground, say, you know, like, I don't know, with regard to like individual psychology or whatnot. I know this is not the, this is not a psychology course, but
Well, I mean, one that I mentioned, one of the most important was the Adorno-Horkheimer Freud and Marx combination in the personality theory of Freud, of sensuality, sex, the id, the ego, the superego were battling, and the authoritarian style of the fascists were directly what they appealed to, and that was the core idea, which still continues in the Lipset and Rokkanl reading for today, in contrasting the dynamics of where and why, and the main author here, the two chapters that make that most explicit for George is from Spain. He was my professor at the time, was Juan Lintz.
Yes.
So Lintz was one of the leading, so Lipset and Wallerstein were both leading students of Lipset, and they were just finishing their PhDs, and they were in this book. So Lintz wrote the key chapters on Germany and Spain, and so the rise of fascism in those two countries, and then contrasting them with great deal on the ground. He asked me just to take a look at those if you want details of individual actors, of what Franco did, what the king did within Spain, contrasting Barcelona against Seville, etc., etc. The regions and the specific, so it's there. So I'm reading those may not be number one on the readings with big stars. The one which we can talk about are the introduction, which is mostly the framework for the whole book and for all these chapters. But second, the chapter by Rokkanl on Norway is the most brilliant on the ground local regional differences. That is, that he spent his whole career on this, and Lipset joined with him. So let me just add in terms of the story about Lipset personally. CCNY refusing to fight. I mean, he fought with Rossi. Rossi went into the U.S. Army. Lipset managed to get an excuse and did not fight in the army because he was against the end of capitalism. He didn't want to support capitalism in a battle for fighting in World War II. After that, after World War II, he was at Columbia, got his PhD, and the Lipset, what was going to make a big point here to pull the pieces together with Lipset. Union democracy we talked about. His father was the typesetter, so union democracy, and how the degree of democracy varied, and it was in a sense. Let me put it another general point. Almost nothing in this course, in this everything we've covered so far, is wrong. Nothing is right or wrong. It's almost all about where and why and when. And so some of these things were stronger in 1880, but they were almost dead in 1920 or 1960 or 1950. So where and why these things changed, and change is the main focus of the readings for today of Lipset and Rokkanl. Okay, so Lipset at Berkeley was surrounded by students and a number of faculty who were left-leaning. Many had been Marxists in the 30s. They came from New York Jewish activists. The Arguing the World is this terrific documentary on Marxism in America, led by New York Jewish intellectuals who were brilliant: Daniel Bell, Lipset, Peter Rossi, Irving Howe, etc. So it's a terrific website, book, film, which is used in. I think there were 3 courses that were using this a couple of years ago. Here at the USC, decades. The documentary was not that old, but the issues began in the 30s, and then they showed how, and there are a number of students and faculty here who were very much active in the same things. Okay, Lipset changed dramatically with '68, so that's really going to be next week. But just to give you the framework briefly. Just before, he was fighting. I mean, he was standing on top of the cars in Berkeley, arguing with the student leaders, because there were student leaders who were some of the first early activists, 62, 63, 64. The free speech movement at Berkeley was 10 years, almost not 10, that was 5 years, 8 years ahead. Columbia was the same, and I was a grad student at Columbia, almost then. So Columbia and Berkeley we were reading, what are they doing at Berkeley? They're doing that, etc. So we're reading, and then SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, was the national movement that was a major leftist, neo-Marxist leadership for students, and it then sent out a newsletter which said, things are really getting important. We were a minor little group when we began just 5 years ago. We now could make a transformation in America, but we've got to reach forward and collaborate with people, and we're going to have to simplify. We're not going to really be as intellectual as we were. We're going to join forces. And so the Mark Rudd at Columbia was this anti-intellectual, tough guy, beat him up kind of stuff. While I was finishing my just to add personally as well, just as what Lipset moved away from, he was at Columbia and at Berkeley. I was teaching a course, to 20 people, and after maybe 2 sessions, there was one guy who must have been in his 60s. And he came up to me afterwards and said, "Do you know who the students are in this class?" I said, "No." He said, "These are all the leaders on campus, and these are the heads of all of the radical activist, neo-Marxist movements, but they're trying to learn more about Marx. And your course has more about Marx than any other course on campus. So they're all here." And they were the heads of organizations like the Red Balloon, or burst those damn fascists. They had wild names that were beginning to become a little bit counterculture, fun, and that is the slogans that were later used, say by the 70s. So we talk about sex, rock and roll, and wild politics. So love was the first word. I forgot. I left out the most important. Love, sex, and rock and roll. That this was part of the concerts. The drugs were beginning to come in, really. It was still a lot of alcohol, but the drugs were beginning to be part of the counterculture and the like. Marijuana, other stuff. Okay, the red hair, green hair, whatever. The 68 they exploded, and 68 then spread across the U.S. and there were then protests in 68 in front of the city halls and on university campuses, fighting against the Vietnam War, especially students. There was a draft. Many of my friends, people were fighting in Vietnam at the time. Vietnam, African American mobilization. So we had Martin Luther King was then being replaced or being challenged by Malcolm X. So Martin Luther King, they passed the Civil Rights Act in 1965, and after 65 they said, okay, let's move north. We'll talk about it a little bit later on, but basically after 65 we had Black Power much more visibly nationally, and then third was the basically student movement of student power down with the administration and occupying administration buildings, and most of the universities in the U.S. called the police. Berkeley, Harvard, Yale, etc. And so the students hated that. They said, and the national television then covered all this stuff, that the students were being beaten up by the police, and this was seen as part of a fascist state over it, etc. So this kind of and then the African Americans, especially, were burning city buildings across in all the major cities with African Americans, more than 5%. I had a visiting German as we looked out the windows in Chicago. It was 69 with the death of Bobby Kennedy and of Martin Luther King. They were both assassinated that year. We looked out the window and there were something like 40 blocks in Chicago were just burning right out of my window. And he, the German visitor, was Erwin Schoik. He was teaching at Harvard at the time. And he said, if this happened in Germany, people would have said, this is a worldwide revolution. But here, this is an indication of how much stability, consensus, and how established this democracy is. That people are taking it without seeing this being a revolution. Okay, so he was right politically. That is, economically, 68 was not an economic revolution, but it was a cultural revolution. And that's the big theme which will continue in the second half as we go on. But questions on anything else that we're covering in the readings thus far? Yes.
And who governs? I know Dahl talked about like the cumulative inequalities versus dispersed inequalities.
Yes.
Are the cumulative ones just a small number of people have more resources than have a great amount of resources, but just disperses? It's just dispersed more throughout the population, and people have maybe various resources.
Yeah, I mean that was then, and now for some remains a battlefield. And so if you focus on, for instance, as Bill Wilson and Bill Wilson would say explicitly, my concern is with the underclass, not with all African Americans. He's only talking about African Americans, and he's only talking about 10%, the poorest bottom 10% that Marx talked about as he had some wonderful list of participants, sitting, people lying in the sidewalks, gurgling. I mean, I can't do as good a job as Marx, but it's fantastic language about, and it was lumpen. It was Marxist term, the lumpen the underclass. It was not proletarian. They're not workers. This is the lumpen proletariat, the bottom of the bottom. Okay, so, and Bill Wilson wrote about that for much of his. So he then would bring in other things about the. I mean, he was not a Marxist. But he followed this sort of feel for this kind of stuff, and but the point I'm making, if Bill Wilson were writing about New Haven, he would have said the same thing.
Okay.
But Dahl looks at the whole political system in New Haven, and he tried to use New Haven for the world. And he said explicitly elsewhere, New Haven's about the same size as Athens. Athens is the classic source of democracy, and we ought to study. Sure, we should not study big cities, and definitely not study nations, because they're too big. There are too many things going on. It's too complicated to see who's really doing what. So instead he added issue areas, and that was a major transformation from the dominant style, which was still Marxist, influenced by Floyd Hunter and by many intellectuals, even if they began to say, it's not really working the way Marx said, but what else can we say? And so Dahl was a revolution in that sense, and he was considered still, and made especially by this book, the top political scientist, probably in the world at the time. And so, did everybody accept everything he said? No. I mean, people fought over these issues. I mean, Lipset. So I, in particular, I was in between the two. I was arguing with Lipset, with Marty for 20 years about these changes, because I'd been through many of the same things myself. So Lipset, adding the point I didn't make explicitly, he left Berkeley because of the flames, and he went to Cambridge, and so in Cambridge things were much more relatively calm. That is, with the students were burning things a little bit, but not like this, not like New York, or especially New York. But Lipset himself, in his own arguing with the students, standing up in Berkeley on top of two cars, and two people. So there's a student there. He was there. It's all on television or loudspeakers and so forth. The revolution is here. It's now. Lipset, well, look more carefully. You're not really looking at the right things. Lipset tried, because he loved. I mean, he was a student like that himself. I mean, he was excited. This was part of a world revolution maybe happening. Well, not really. So he left Berkeley, went to Harvard. And so at Harvard, he did two big things. He read Talcott Parsons. And Parsons is the major, and we'll read more about from Parsons directly in the next section of the course. But and then he teamed up for editing the book with Stein Rokkanl internationally. So Rokkanl was a brilliant leading European analyst, especially distilling the best aspects of sort of local regions within Europe and where and why they were different within Norway and within France, within Germany and so forth. And they then they put together how it's not just Marx and it's not just traditional region, it's a combination of the two. And so and each of the chapters do that. And so they play off these competing interpretations through the whole book, including Juan Linz, Marty Lipset, but Emmanuel Wallerstein, etc. Okay, so that's my quick overview. In terms of Dahl at the time, Lipset and Rokkanl were moving toward Dahl within their own work. And Dahl was explicitly, of course, challenging Hunter, but Dahl nevertheless, he was in his middle of it was his most creative years. He must have been in his 40s or so. I'll even add, my mother was a collaborator of Mrs. Dahl, and they were my mother had been politically active in Democratic Party politics for her all from the with the Marxists in the 1930s and continue and then continuing on up. So she said, Terry, you're going to Yale. You're going to go to visit people at Yale about whether you want to go to grad school there. Could you pick up a copy of Bob Dahl's new book? So should be at the Yale bookstore. So I got her a copy, and I thought, this is my mother does local politics. I wasn't interested. I was interested in the world, and big Marxist thing. So I got her a copy, and the next year, I went to grad school, and we were assigned Who Governs. Hey, this is my mother's book. Okay, and I realized, wow, this is I was wrong. My mother didn't know either, but she was in touch with people like that I saw parts of this from it was Connecticut local politics, state and local. Okay. Mary Dahl. The follow-up on Dahl, follow-up on anything else like that, any more on that? Well, the key dimensions of Who Governs. Add a couple of other big concepts. You mentioned pluralism, or say the fragmentation. What else? Who else does anybody want to add? Good ID questions for an exam. Anybody remember any other things? That is what you've learned and should learn through the whole course. Are some tools like these, some key concepts, some key ways of asking yourself which of these will interpret what's happening in Shanghai versus Beijing today. These are there, and how much does this fit with this European model of 50 years before, or which does not? And there sections that I'm talking about week by week with the Chinese right now. Okay, pyramiding. What's pyramiding?
So if a politician were to use most or more of their Slack resources to then further expand the amount of resources they have at their...
Will use what?
Well, use more of their Slack resources so that they can obtain more Slack resources, or just more resources, and it sort of pyramid out their power.
Okay, you said you've had one critical new concept, Slack. 90% of voters are not engaged. Maybe 50%, 30% vote, and most of them do not vote. Maybe, lots. That's a potential, that is slack. It's a big measure of slack, non-voting. But if you can create a sense of excitement or something the way Obama did when he was running among African Americans, or when Harold Washington was running for mayor of Chicago, they went up to 90% by African Americans, 90% turnout. That's a huge potential resource which changed the whole outcome in nationally and in Chicago. So the idea, the critical point which Dahl really stresses is where and how resources are converted into influence, that actual decisions get made differently. But he's making explicitly that Hunter is wrong. If you've got a lot of money, if you own the newspaper, you may not have any impact because you may not use your resources to spend in New Haven, or if, as I mentioned, say Bill Gates. If you're Bill Gates, may live in his local town, but he may not care about it. I just don't know how much he's been involved. But my point is, there are lots of people with lots of money, and then poor people with a lot of time that they're using other than in politics. So this pyramiding is you put things together, and so those can be black voters, student activists, etc. So pyramiding, but you can metaphorically build a pyramid by having, say, 3 resources, and you have, well, 1, 2, 3, and those 3 together, you need to have a bigger impact by having a coalition with a union, with the Italians in New Haven, etc., and they then could elect the new mayor. So that's illustrating the transformation of the resources using such concepts as pyramiding and slack, moving away from the image that business leadership may be valid in New Haven for certain business decisions, but wrong for the mayoral election and wrong for school board issues. That's the key kind of finding. Yes.
Doesn't he also?
So your name again is?
Andrea.
Andrea. Okay.
He also, I think, explains, or I guess I would like some more background on this point, but I think he also, and I think it's related to what you were just talking about, how.
So okay to have your
yeah.
face. Okay, great. Andrea.
How government is almost controlled by small groups with pockets of influence, but how it's like the broader preferences of the people that ultimately govern those small groups, which in turn govern the entirety of the government.
That can be the case, and it sure was the case in terms of my class at Columbia. But but in terms of African Americans, put differently, what Bill Wilson was talking about, the lumpen proletariat maybe never voted at all, because there may be one half of 1% of the but they can so on some campuses, politically sensitive, brilliant people like Bill Wilson, they can play this up, and there's lots of examples. So I'm agreeing with exactly with what you've said, and that in a sense, what is the label that Lipset and Dahl used for what you talked about, everybody? It's another concept to keep in mind. I mean, that's a very important point to carry with you when you're asking yourself, is this, what proportion of the people, in Vermont or in Catalonia and would fit with what you're talking about? And what's the concept here? We talked about Schumpeter, Dahl, Lipset, the elite theory of democracy. It was not the majority. This is the opposite of Anthony Downs stressed. That if we can apply an economic model of the whole political system, all of the consumers should have an impact, and at least the normative view is that the majority of all the citizens, as the polls and anything else might show, should be translated into policy. And if that does not, we are having a failure in democracy. And there's a lot of rhetoric that you hear on this campus and around the world. So part of the interpretation of what I'm giving you right here is the ideology of the participants, sometimes the analysts or so Lipset himself shared these kinds of concerns. That's what's brilliant about the documentary. These people shared both. That's why I said he didn't join the army, because morally he said it's immoral. And not only it's immoral to join the capitalist system that's going to be killed off. Okay, so the elitist theory of democracy is focus on the elites and don't expect, but you can try to look and that is so. What we've had a lot more new data since '68. We have many more people saying we want to have this egalitarianism has taken off hugely since '68, ideologically, but has it really changed that much? That's an empirical question. On some things, yes. No, yeah, George. Yeah.
I thought what we last class that societies were pretty much the same, the only thing that different there was the lead, and if you had a function, you would only be different at the tails. So I thought that was we agreed last time. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, remind me, but I don't remember that. But tell me a little more about what
Because
you
we were
have
saying,
is there a reading? Is there a reading that?
yes, because we're talking about the elite theory of democracy,
Okay.
right? And I asked you the question, yeah. So what's the difference between societies, yeah? And we agreed that societies were pretty much very similar, but it was the elite what makes them different. Mhm.
Yeah, okay. I would say the critical point which you left out is made them different in terms of what? And the quick thing the point I made and which is in there and is in our later readings, which we'll see empirically, is the parties. The parties and the party ideology differed a lot in the degree to which they were more or less responsive to all of the citizens. And so the two countries which I pointed to were the least responsive, where the leaders said explicitly, I vote against the majority of my citizens all the time, were in Poland and Italy, pre-68. After 68, there was basically both of those political systems, I should say pre-89. There was Berlin Wall was the biggest change in Italy and Poland, and all those leaders were gone. And the Italian political system had communists, socialists, and Christian Democrats from 1945 and basically until the Berlin Wall. Soon after the Berlin Wall went down, those political parties died, and we now have 30 parties basically instead in Italy. Why? And so why the change? There are two big reasons, and I'm using this because it's perhaps one of the most dramatic cases on your general point. Many of the Christian Democrats and socialists voters would say, or their leaders would say, we're voting against the citizens, and the citizens. If you look at Putnam's data on Italian data, that was the case. That the citizens were not getting the leaders what they wanted, or in terms of the policies. The leaders were more following an elite. There were the elite party programs, and the Christian and so the after the Berlin Wall went down, 89, what happened by the voters? And I mean, I wouldn't have thought of this, but the smart Italian interpreters, and there's a section in the book. This is a chapter 3, I think, of the book called The New Political Culture by Enrico Ercole. We really co-authored that little bit. And Guido Martinati. These are two top people. He was a student of Guido Martinati. He'd been a grad student here as well. The answer was, with the Berlin Wall down, the communists no longer saying we really want to dominate the Eastern Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, but then this Communist Party within that is the Soviet Union ended. That is the Communist Party domination ended, and it became much more complicated in Russia. But the point is, in Italy, the voters had been afraid of the Communist Party coming all the way from Poland and Russia to Italy, that they voted for the Christian Democrats and the Socialists, even though they did not support the strong clergy of the Roman Catholic Church, nor did they support the corrupt clientelism of basically all the three big parties were doing lots of clientelism. and so such that estimates would be 10 to 20% more. Everything costs more than in other countries because you're paying off so many other people to do business, to get anything, to get a fee if you're a little person, whatever. And there's a lot of clientelism today still in Italy. But the bottom line, those people who were, instead of supporting the Christian Democrats and socialists anymore, they were no longer afraid that they started voting for Greens, for women, not very many women in Italy, let me be more careful. For Greens, yes, and for transparency. That is, there's a big difference between Northern and Southern Europe. The Northern Europeans are much closer to the U.S. with this sort of moralistic concern and the counterculture. There was minimal counterculture in Italy. The family was much stronger, and in that sense, it's halfway to Asia. So with the Asians, the family and the state were and are stronger still. But Southern Europe and Latin America are a first step in this direction, and they've moved somewhat toward the Northern Europeans and the U.S., but they're still very different in terms of the family. Okay, and the states in these other parts. So these variations are valuable because you can see the workings of the family and of the state and its different policies. And the other name we have to not forget, or we're not forgetting. I'm just mentioning orally, Berlusconi, because he owned a lot of media companies, and he really played up. He used the media in a very thoughtful, creative way, and they would have things. They would have, say, a 3 to 4 hour television program where they managed to get the former prime minister, the former president, the current president, the current prime minister, those 4 top political leaders who were then elsewhere in Europe and so forth. They were all there on television, and they were on television with school teachers and 12-year-old students in Bosnia and in Serbia, where you have people in former Yugoslavia were arguing against the prime minister, and the style of these 4 top prime minister of Italy, they said, oh, you're right, I have to listen to that more carefully. I was unbelievably shocked at the cultural transformation after 1968. In those kind of examples, France even more so, or I wouldn't say more so, but that is in terms of the media and the style and the steps toward egalitarianism, at least symbolically, and the media broadcasting. So Pierre Bourdieu did this with great finesse, and he was on long television conversations with people, and he had a sort of moralistic thing. This is the ministry of culture. They're taking your money away. They're not serving the people. They're not et cetera, et cetera. So, and you've got a lot of intellectuals still who say that still today. Okay. More questions? Big or small? So we got. Anything else that was unclear? I mean, these were. It's great to have you reinvent the elitist theory of democracy. It's one more small. It's not that big a deal. Well, it seems it's easy enough to do right now. 50 years, whatever later. But at the time, it was a revolution. That is who governs. Not only he's saying, we don't have a simple economic business dominance, but he's also saying it is not It's absolutely not Anthony Downs where everybody is getting what the average citizen wants. We have elites within issue areas, and those small elites were the key actors. The teachers' union, the mayor, the only person active across the 3 issue areas was the mayor and a couple of people with him, a couple of other civic leaders in Chicago. I've been to budget hearings in Chicago, in the city of Chicago government. They're empty except for the chairman, a couple of the members of the city council budget committee, with one taxpayers association, one representative from the taxpayers association, and the president of the League of Women Voters, and nobody else. Nobody from the general public or from the, maybe there's someone from the media, maybe not. Okay. And they're making big budgetary decisions. Okay. Let me mention a couple of other sort of big concepts. Ralph Dahrendorf. I need that. Write the name down. Is that clear? So I don't think we have a reading from him. But you understand? Can you write that name out yourself without saying it, or shall I want me to write it down?
Dahrendorf.
Okay. Okay. One big concept. Class is smokers fighting non-smokers. Class is anything that people are fighting about in terms of social disagreement. And so in a sense, it's a post-Marx redefinition of class conflict. So yes, what he's redefining and saying we have a lot of conflict is still there. And as I read through just last night, looking at the introduction to Lipset and Rokkanl, they're saying politics is about conflict, but they're not saying it's about the proletarians versus the capitalists. And where and why and how did we have aspects of Marx working or not working in different parties, in different countries, in different regions? Because there's a lot of, I mean, the degree to which Marx still had more impact through a lot of this whole field than still any other single author, probably more than Weber. Weber sort of came later and whatever, but Marx had a big, and I'm pointing especially most visibly to Lipset himself and students like Wallerstein. So Wallerstein became a major. That is, after he did his PhD with Lipset, I took a course with Wallerstein, which had nothing to do with Marx and nothing to do with was really it was closer to Daniel Bell, coming post-industrial society. 2 or 3 years after that, he completely changed, and we worked together. I talked with him many times about this. That he took the French historical idea that European politics was dominating the Mediterranean. So it's the French theory is European domination of North Africa is a cultural sort of colonial domination. And what Wallerstein did was to take that and apply it to Latin America, Africa, and the Third World, and talked in somewhat ideological terms. And he left Columbia because he was disagreeing with the others there at the time. But he was a major international figure, and some people on this campus are now using Wallerstein as a major source of moralistic and analytical discussion for current politics. Okay, so the redefinition of class then led to the whole class politics debate. If you take the and Lipset himself was largely using that definition. That is, Lipset himself was saying politics is about conflict. So if you think about differently, I mean, what can we think of? Now here's one simple example. The Scandinavians. Scandinavians don't raise their voices. They don't shout. They don't throw tomatoes at each other on the face. They're very consensual in style and calm, and for many purposes they say very few words. The Italians, the Spanish, the French talk loud. They make shake their arms, say, "Oh, it's a revolution for us now." You go to parades in Paris. Oh my God! You think the buildings are going to collapse. It's so loud. There's so many people are, banging and banging up and down 68. I was there in 1968. The students were there. They had big shovels. They were banging on the streets. They were picking up the cobblestones, throwing them over onto the sidewalks. There were 300 people watching. 2 of them were doing this. It wasn't a student revolution. It was a handful of 2 or 3. Not 2 or 3. There were dozens, hundreds, but there were thousands watching. Okay, etc. So the Scandinavian contrast, which I'm pointing to here, we had an evaluation of the Norwegian social scientists, all the Norwegian social science, especially with an urban focus. And there were 4 of us who were invited: Guido Martinati from Italy, 2 top people from England, and me. 4 outsiders, and we reviewed maybe 30 of the top grants from all the socials in all the social sciences, especially in social political science. And in 2 days, lots and lots of meetings. At the end of the first day, the Italian, Guido Marti, and I both said the same thing. Is there no conflict in Scandinavia? And the Scandinavians looked around. Oh, this is the world. Wait a minute. Okay. So the Scandinavians just don't see what conflict is when the French and the Italians and the Spanish, we have a civil war that we're in the midst of. So there's a lot of, but that has an impact with media, with intellectuals, with students, and that is, okay, also teaching at the same time as Wallerstein and Daniel Bell and Lazarsfeld and Merton was C. Wright Mills. Okay, why was C. Wright Mills important here? He published a book called The Marxists. And what was his conclusion? Were the new Marxists, proletarian in a class politics model, were who? You, the students. The proletariat has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller through the 50. I mean, even though this is in the middle of industrialization of the big corporations in the 60s, their politics, that is, the big corporations, Ford, General Motors, and so forth, they had massively invested with fancy, high-tech production lines, and so you had people mostly pressing buttons. They weren't lifting heavy back kind of stuff. We had a massive transformation of the industrial system. Became much more fewer and fewer workers, and more became office people and managers and a handful of people who pressed the buttons. Okay, so Marty Lipset then worked on student politics. He went to Harvard. He also did a book with David Reisman because he's brand new. He's trying to, what the hell are these people doing in New England? He didn't know I mean, he didn't, as he said in the 1930s, they didn't know anything about the Democratic or Republican parties. They only talked about Marx and Trotsky and, and so forth in New York. So when he got to Harvard, he really wanted, so David Reisman was a gentleman, Jewish in fact, but he grew up as an aristocratic sort of style. When he was here at Chicago, many people just hated him because he had a gentlemanly, elegant approach, looking down at Chicago and so forth. But so he went to Harvard and he was very popular with students. He was seen as the quintessence of Harvard's style. So Marty wrote a book with him, but Marty then played up, in the second decades of Harvard, 1700, they had they had a student strike. The students struck because they were doing so Marty was looking for conflict and finding it even in the students there, and then he went on to test these kinds of things and then see where and why these kinds of conflicts engage the citizens the way he was fighting with the students at Berkeley and the way he had earlier in New York. Okay, so student politics are part of the story. Okay, so Marty was making these changes. I then said, hey Marty, why don't we do a paper together? Our social class is dying. I said, wow, that's a good title. So we published it, and immediately there were two. So it's a summary of kind of stuff that I'm talking about here. You can see through the course in detail as you. So, for example, 3 general propositions state this argument. Hierarchy generates and maintains rigid class relations. Hierarchy. The greater the hierarchical differentiation among persons in a social unit, the deeper its class divisions tend to become. See, so I'm trying to say, where do we have this kind of class and conflict? Since the degree of hierarchy may vary with a society, we add, okay, here's a big concept that's useful. Not just class, but situs. So the situs this is like doll. Situs is similar to issue areas in doll, or among the economists, William Musgrave has the leading textbook on public finance. He's an economist. Urban public finance, or no, it's not just urban, it's national, it's more national government. And he called it arena. And then in political science, this got taken over with the Tony Downs and others. And Paul Peterson did his book where he then used the term arena is critically important. And in a sense, it's like the election of the mayor, economic development, the school board. These are situses where these things can be various. They can be issue areas, or they can be people who are ranked in terms of, let's say, the old wide angle, or say, let's call it ethnic, the ethnic groups. So the ethnic groups, maybe the old WASPs in New Haven. Then we have these new leaders, or the Italian and Irish leaders, Catholics. Basically, they became the majority of the citizens, and they basically voted out all the WASPs in the late 1880s, 1880s, and then down up, say, others. But basically, what Tocqueville commented on when he saw this happening, not quite in that way, but in terms of the active involvement, this was before Tocqueville, but basically others building on Tocqueville did say, these quiet WASP leaders in New Haven simply withdrew. They moved to the suburbs, and they stayed in business and civic groups, but they were not in politics. New York that wasn't true. So Gabriel Almond did his PhD on how some of the New York WAPs and the Jews were fighting against the Italian Catholics, who really the leaders in the party, Democratic Party, and the Jews then organized around the unions in New York. But the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants mostly moved to the suburbs, and I would say mostly, but in terms of the larger numbers, transformed a lot of the central city politics, and certainly the New York, New Haven, Providence, Boston, Philadelphia, and to a considerable degree, Chicago, Cleveland as well. Okay, so the more the hierarchy, so the greater the hierarchical differentiation in each situs, the more salient are class-defined patterns in informal social relations, cultural outlooks, and support for social change, such as support for social movements. So we're talking about the beginnings of these new social movements that transformed after '68. Third proposition, the more the hierarchy declines, as the converse of these first two propositions, the more that these hierarchies decline, the more structured social class relations diminish in salience, and the larger the number of situs which evidence declining hierarchy, the less salient are class relations in the society. Okay, that's the big argument of the breakdown of class politics, which is to say, the battle is not about capitalism versus socialism, it's about hierarchy. And you can have hierarchy in a union, as Michel's argued, or you can have unions can be much more open and democratic, as in the as in one union did. But etc. Okay, so Marty would never have written this 5 years before, and I wrote it, but he said, okay, yes, dragging, but then after he was there, so that as you can see this, I mean, at the time, we were arguing over all this stuff. 10 to 15 years later, he further on a reading list, we will read the American Exceptionalism. That was his last major book, and that shows many of these deep changes that distill and synthesize what he then did 10 years or so later. And the whole field has changed and is more consistent with what we do in the two books from me called The New Political Culture, with many. That is what I wrote most of it, but I learned from the arguments from all of these people whose names I'm mentioning, especially the Europeans. We had many. I was president, founder of the Community Urban Association. We had mostly Europeans. And they completely disagreed with me. I mean, they all said class politics is European, world politics is all about class and parties. And Terry, you're talking about these new things happening. That's irrelevant, etc. So I'm saying these were among the majority of the people were still back with Marty Lipset's book Political Man, with its secular Marxism. Today, things have changed. But I would say the political system changed first, and 2, 5, 10, 20 years later, the social scientists are changing. And the way you can see them first, that is, I went to national meetings, not only the American Political Science Association, nobody would say this at the beginning, but with the journalists in Washington. I was active with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, helping them lobby with the federal government, with the national media, and have national policies at the time. And and I was invited from several of the media then to write about these changes, because I was the only person who said this so sharply, that these changes are happening. But the reason, I mean, it wasn't because I'm smarter. It's because I was focused more on local stuff, and they were focused on national stuff. And so they saw more the weakened differences within Washington, whereas if you've got extreme cases like New Haven, Berkeley, Austin, and then Waco. So Waco is Waco would be a classic old Texas boy, old boy Texas style, clientelist way, drastically, the total opposite of Berkeley. So if you see these kinds of differences and where and why they're going up and down, you could see these earlier in ways that we could see the taxpayers revolt when nobody else did, etc. But as you can see, when I'm interested in world transformations. And I've now got data for it because we've got through this organization, the International the ISA Committee, the FAWI Project, and the SCENES Project. We've got hundreds of people working on these around the world, asking about these questions. But you learn in the process, and so we would learn from each other, and we would try to invite smart mayors or smart. So I mean, for instance, at some of the key critical meetings. The French Socialist Party, the German Socialist Party sponsored big conferences that we held in the U.S. and in Europe, and in both cases, we went with people who spoke. For instance, Bill Morris was the mayor of Waukegan, Illinois, and he was very smart, and he was doing these early things when he didn't. 10 years ahead of other cities. So I got him involved and took him to Washington, and he would say that New York. Here's why New York and San Francisco and Houston are different. With these mayors are moving in this direction. But he didn't say this, but he's already done it 5 years before, so he could articulate these things more. And he's very, very smart and articulate. So we went to Paris at a big European meeting funded by 200 people, 100 people chosen by the Socialist Party. 100 people are academics and consultants, all talking to each other. And Bill Morris came up there and then gave his general presentation. People said, there's nobody in Europe like that. It's totally wild, different thing. 1 year later, 2 years later, they had elections in France, and there were people like Bill Morris elected. Okay, so. Questions about any of that? So that is, these are hard questions about how to analyze them. If you're a mayor, if you're an active, not very many, but one of the very active citizens. If you're a student leader, if you're a social scientist, and often, and I would say today, the world is changing faster than ever, at least certainly than the 19th and 20th century. And the big changes include China and these kinds of things that are going on around the world. China is critical right now for European and the U.S., not to mention, I'd say, Russia and the Ukraine, but I would say background much bigger. I mean, how do we fit Russia and Ukraine into these battles, into this interpretation? And but the foreign policy part for China, I won't try to summarize for it to simple, but it's much simpler. That's more complicated. Russia and Ukraine is a simpler issue in this respect. How would you interpret anything we've been talking about here? Russia's more like Poland pre-68 and Italy. Strong party, strong communist party. No, let me say that's no longer true. It was. The model is there. The state is there. The Communist Party is not really in Russia anymore. But the model of how to do that from Stalin is still Stalin, when he died for 10 years, whatever, they took they took his remains away from the Red Square. People said, Stalin, we're way beyond Stalin. Now, Putin, they brought back Stalin. Stalin is in Red Square now. Stalin is a hero, and Putin wants to go back to what Stalin did. He wants a Soviet Union again, and he wants strong family, strong tradition, strong hierarchy, strong state. And those girls who are, doing bad stuff in the churches, Lady Gaga, no, we can't let Lady Gaga can't come to Russia, etc. And because Ukraine, that guy, the Russians are putting out these cartoons, and they show Zelensky's drugged. Right now, which country is fighting more visibly? France. There are new cartoons showing Macron dancing roughly in his 20s with hair like this, and he looks as if he's on drugs. I don't know if it's made up by a cartoonist, but it's the way these things socially and culturally and symbolically are fighting over these issues. And they're not unique to any one of these countries. You find similar to this, aspects of this all around the world, including China. Within China, not just one top leader, but if you talk to you folks, including Chinese students who are here at the University of Chicago, but you can talk about these issues if you ask the right subtle questions. Not be blunt the way I'm trying to be. I'm trying to be a little bit blunt to give you the big simpler points, but the subtle detail about stuff in the street is in those chapters that I'm referring you to. Anything else? Okay. 5:50. We will have the exam on Wednesday, and our TA is sick. Yeah. Be careful. Lots of people are sick. In both my courses, both TAs are sick. But they're staying home. You can stay home if you don't feel well on Wednesday, and if you have a cough or two, you can still do the exam. Any questions on the exam?
Do we need to buy the booklets?
Which booklets? No.
You give us the booklets?
No. You have this at home. You type on your machine, on your computer, as an MS Word document, and so we will send you at the beginning of class time. You'll get an email, and or maybe 5 minutes early, you get the exam. You write it during the exam time, and I was going to have the TA talk more about this because he's working on it right now, but he hasn't sent it yet. So apologies from the two of us. And he will administer the details. But basically, he will send you the exam. You write your answers. You'll have some ID questions, which are maybe, I think, 5 or 6, and you answer about 3 of those. And then there's maybe 2 essays, and you write about an essay on one of those 2 topics that you can choose. And it's broad enough that you can use those things that you know about. So you need to craft a well-presented essay and pull the pieces together the way you've done this in class. Yes?
Is the expectation that we have like quotes from the reading, or is it sufficient to just say like Lipset says this?
Yeah, generally that's enough. I mean, if you want to contrast, say, Lipset and Political Man versus Lipset and Rokkanl or something different, I mean, if you want to, but I would say no. I mean, you don't have time to really have long quotes or any real quotes. If it's something clear, such as we've talked about today, that's. But do say Lipset or I mean, and so that.
And then like the work title.
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of things we're talking about today are perfect for you to write about, like, pyramiding, Slack, elitist theory of democracy. These are big concepts. You ought to be able to write about those clearly and specifically and rapidly, and give us some of your own words about it.
By ID, what do you mean? Just short questions? Name 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or the first part of the exam?
Yeah.
Is like list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or I mean, you
The-
can
the-
ask like a concept, and we say
They'll just be like elite theory of democracy or pluralism.
yeah,
And then we have to just define.
define it.
Yeah,
And
but,
so definitions.
but I would say, but not more than a narrow, simple, simplistic definition. Try to give us a little. I mean, that is the first I think are 30%, and the essay is 70%. So the essay is the main thing. So allocate 70% of your time, and making it, and what I would say to prepare. Give yourself, if you want, once or twice that time period, and showing you and doing the exam on your own, say tonight or tomorrow, before the exam day. Then you'll have a feel. You'll only have time to write maybe 20% of what you know. There's not time. You've got it in your head, but you've got to be able to write that clearly and coherently, and just distill a little bit. So if you can get a sense of, use that time efficiently, and yes, you want to have the definition, but say a little bit more. But especially it's the essay, in terms of the grade. Yeah.
And then, I mean, I guess, do you find that students have a better way of studying all the material that kind of makes more sense? Like, I've just been looking over my readings and writing the main points down.
Absolutely, and that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can look at those. It's open book. You can look at these books. You can look at them during the exam, but you can't paste into the exam from your notes. That is, if you wrote your notes, the day before, that's the reason we're not telling you the specific concepts. We're not telling you the topic of the essay. So that's new. So that you've got to be able to write an original essay on a new topic using these kinds of concepts. That's what's hard about it.
Yeah.
And but the big point is, you're only going to have a small amount of time, and you've got much more than you can say. So how can you focus it? But I would say, to your question, you're coming back, how to prepare, for sure, summarizing, looking at this, but also I think I can see in the margin you've got maybe criticisms or comments of your own, which is great. I mean, that shows you're thinking about these issues, and that's why we recommend doing, posting stuff, if you want, each session or each day on the discussion board. You can post your notes like that if you haven't done so. You can post those on the discussion board. And then at the end of the course, you can turn in all of those in your MS Word document. And that's fine.
And when we finish, we just send it back.
Yes, yeah. So it finishes at class time. It's due at that time, and the email will stamp your time sent and received.
Ah, okay.
So it's like essentially a reply to the original email. Is it a reply to the original email, or should it be like a new email? I guess.
You don't need an email. You just send us the exam. You don't need a fancy email.
No, I mean in response to the original email sending the exam materials, or
Yeah, send it back to me, a copy to my email, and to the TA, Sharon's. Both of those are at the top of the syllabus, and they will be in the exam itself. So you can just copy those two emails and paste those at the top of the email, and send the exam finished, written by you, back to the two of us. Okay? You don't need to use Canvas or anything else. You use MS Word, or that is ideally an MS Word document. If you can't do that, send us a text. Don't send a PDF. We can't edit or comment to you on a PDF. Send us a text, or ideally an MS Word document, just to help us and you send comments in there. Yeah,
Any formal rubrics?
any formal what?
Rubrics.
Rubrics?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
So it's like, is there like a breakdown of just how many points you get for like each kind of, I don't know, consistency?
Yeah, I told you.
Like
Oh, no,
mechanism?
not something like that.
Okay.
No.
It's like a general impression thing.
We've done that in the past, it ends up being the same thing, it's a waste of time to worry about
Okay,
that.
I see. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay.